After covering some particularly dark topics recently, I decided to focus this video on a mystery that isn't quite so disturbing, but certainly no less intriguing. Nights of the Werewolf was a 1968 horror movie, a cursed movie, some claimed, that due to a tragic occurrence faded into obscurity. But there's so much more to this enigma than initially meets the eye. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video is sponsored by June's Journey. If you're a subscriber on my channel, it's safe for me to assume that you like mysteries, so I think it'd also be safe for me to assume that you'll love this game. June's Journey is a free-to-download murder mystery mobile game where you will solve the perplexing murder of June's sister by finding hidden objects and uncovering her family's secrets. It's set in the 1920s, and I love the vintage, vibrant aesthetics. There's so much attention to detail that you get lost in every scene. You can also customize and remodel your mansion and garden island, which is a fun activity in itself. I spend a lot of time looking into real-life mysteries to cover on this channel, so playing this game that's based around a fictional murder is a good way to unwind at the end of the day. If you're looking for a beautiful and engaging mystery game that you can enjoy at your leisure, then you should definitely try June's Journey. It's available for free on Android, iOS, and PC through Facebook Games, so click the link in the description to start solving the murder now. Nights of the Werewolf, or Las Noches del Hombre Lobo, its original Spanish title, forgive my bad pronunciation, was a Spanish-French horror movie allegedly produced in 1968. The plot involved a professor who discovers that his student, Waldemar Daninsky, suffers with lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric syndrome that causes someone to delusionally believe that they have transformed into, or can turn into, an animal, in this case a wolf. The scientist pretends to help Waldemar, telling him he will investigate the curse, but in actuality plans to use sound waves to control him, to use his dangerous compulsions as a result of the curse for his own revenge. Sounds like a pretty average werewolf movie, right? So why am I making a video on it? Well, first of all, there are claims that the movie was cursed. Secondly, no one actually knows if it ever even existed. Jacinto Molina Alvarez, more commonly known as Paul Nashi, born in 1934, was a Spanish actor, screenwriter and director, who has been referred to as the king of Spanish horror cinema. He also worked as an illustrator for a Spanish record label at one point and wrote Western pulp novels under the pseudonym Jack Mills. His work as an actor began in the early 1960s when he was an uncredited extra in a few movies, including King of the Vikings and King of Kings. Throughout his career, he played many iconic characters, such as Jack the Ripper, the Mummy, Dracula, and the Hunchback, but it could be said that Daninsky the Werewolf was his signature role, as this character appeared in a franchise, the first or second installment, sources vary, allegedly being Nights of the Werewolf. The rest of the movies are not lost, and their existence is not in question. When speaking about his Daninsky character, in addition to Paul saying he didn't create it to make a series of films about him, things just worked out that way, he also said, "Quite simply, it's me. The pity is I can't become a werewolf in true life. All too often I would like to. It's obvious that in the works of every man there is much of his true self. Like Valdemar, I too have been left aside and misunderstood. I've spent all my life swimming against the current." So the character was clearly important to Paul, and the next movie it starred in was The Mark of the Wolfman. This was either the second or third installment out of 12, This is a bit confusing, as most sources imply that Nights of the Werewolf was the first movie, and others claim it was the second, but going by the dates, Mark of the Wolfman appears to have been the earliest one apart from Nights of the Wolfman. The screenplay was written in 1968, and this was apparently the year that Nights was produced. It's possible both were produced within that 1 year, as seems to be implied by the following quote from an interview with Paul in 1994. The release of La Masa del Hombre Lobo in Paris, an impressive success I suppose, is what led the French television director René Govard to call me about doing a script. I wrote it, adding a number of somewhat novel ideas, and we began filming. It was shot in Paris in 5 weeks. The film told the story of a professor who discovers that one of his pupils suffers from the curse of lycanthropy. Under the guise of helping him, the professor instead uses him as an instrument of revenge. He dominates the pupil during his transformations by means of sound waves, and in this manner causes him to act against the people he wants to get rid of. I left after my work was finished, but owing to the legal problems resulting from Govard's death, the film was impounded. Not long ago I was in Paris trying to ascertain what had become of the film without any results. I believe it's become one of those so-called lost films, which could be anywhere, and that perhaps someday someone will locate and recover it. Anyway, as for Nights, Paul was the only person known to have insisted that it ever existed. No one else who was part of the cast or crew was ever interviewed or came out themselves to support Paul's claims. If he hadn't stuck to his story until the day he died in 2009, one might think it had all just been a dream. According to Paul, his scenes for Nights were filmed in Paris. This seems to imply either that other scenes were filmed elsewhere, or that Paul just wasn't sure where the rest of it was filmed. It's worth remembering that he had never actually seen the movie. He wrote the script, played the role, and the rest was out of his hands. He claimed that a man named René Govard directed the film, and according to Wikipedia, he also co-wrote the script with Paul and an individual known only as C. Bellard. It sounds like all the scenes were filmed, as apparently the film was sent off to the lab for processing, but a week later, René was killed in a car accident. After this, no one ever paid the negative costs, so the lab kept the film for collateral and later lost it, or destroyed it, hence it was never released. That's one story at least. Another is that the film was in René's car when he crashed and it got destroyed. Admittedly, I don't know much about producing a movie, but I would have thought that if they went to the lengths of writing the script, casting actors, and actually filming the scenes, that they wouldn't just forget about the movie after René died. The first story perhaps suggests that René was supposed to pay the negative costs, and because he died, no one else did, but it was more Paul's film than it was René's, and considering the character was important to him, why wouldn't he ensure it was released? With that in mind, it might seem more plausible that the film was destroyed in the car accident. In that case, it might have seemed like more hassle than it was worth to go through the process of reshooting all over again. Paul did say in his 1994 interview that it had a fairly good budget for its time, quote, "That picture was shot in Paris with a fairly good budget for its time. I remember including some scenes of the Wolfman on the Parisian rooftops surrounded by fog. The film ran into serious economic problems which resulted in lawsuits, but the most unfortunate thing was that director René Govard was killed in a car accident shortly after filming was completed. I was at the French Film Archives not too long ago, and I believe they've conserved a trailer for the film there, but not the film itself. It is really a damned film. Perhaps someday it will surface, I don't know. I've tried to locate it, but I haven't had any results." I have contacted the Film Archives department of the Ministère de la Culture to see if they have a trailer or any information about the movie or anyone who was involved in it. If I don't mention that again in this video, then assume I haven't heard back yet, but if I do, I'll update in a community post. When questioned about the movie in interviews, Paul could not remember most of the actors who starred alongside him, apart from Peter Beaumont and Monique Brainville. Though bizarrely, according to Wikipedia and the Lost Media Wiki, neither of them even existed. There is a page for Peter on IMDb, but the only movie he's credited for acting in is Nights of the Werewolf. There are no photos of him and no further information whatsoever. The only other Peter Beaumont I found a record for was on a couple of other sites as well as IMDb, all of which claimed he played a minor role in the 2002 movie Before You Go, and IMDb also lists him as a character in Russian Doll from 2001. They could be the same person. Presumably the Peter who starred in Nights of the Werewolf was either Spanish or French, and according to Wikipedia, the character this Peter played in Before You Go was Javier, who was Spanish. Again, none of these sources provide any details about this Peter, not even a photo, let alone any links to Nights of the Werewolf. So it's impossible to say how plausible it is that this is the Peter we're looking for, though Before You Go was a UK film and Russian Doll was Australian, and considering Nights was Spanish-French and filmed in France, it doesn't seem very likely that an almost unknown actor would suddenly end up featuring in two movies at opposite ends of the world in a different language over 30 years later, when he likely would have been at least in his 70s at that point. I did find another Wikipedia page for a man named Peter Wolf, whose stage name was Victor Beaumont. It is possible that Paul might have known both his real name and stage name and accidentally merged them to get Peter Beaumont. Victor was born in 1912 and was active between the 1930s and 1977, the year he died. He was born in Germany but emigrated to the UK in the 30s and appeared in a number of British films and TV dramas, as well as a few Hollywood movies in the 60s. Almost all of his roles were in movies and shows in English or German, however he did feature in La Demoiselle d'Avignon, a French TV show from 1972. This was just 4 years after filming for Nights allegedly occurred, and apparently at least one of the episodes was filmed in Paris, so it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Victor spent a few years living in France, and was part of the cast in both Nights and this TV show. It might be relevant to mention that Mark of the Wolfman, the sequel or prequel to Nights, depending which source you believe, was, according to some sources, a Spanish and German co-production. If Paul and Co. worked with actors or producers in Germany to make one of the other movies in the franchise, it seems more plausible that a German actor may have appeared in Nights. Given the lack of information for Nights and the fact that it was never released, it wouldn't be too surprising if Victor Beaumont was the Peter Beaumont that Paul mentioned, that the information was never corrected. Would there be much point ensuring your role was well known in a movie that never materialised? But again, without further information, it's impossible to make a link, and considering we're relying on Paul getting his name wrong, it does seem a bit of a stretch. I found even less information for Monique Brainville. Again, an IMDb page with Nights as the only credit, and a couple of other sites with no further information. I didn't come across anyone else with a similar name that she could have been mistaken for either. Unfortunately, the same can be said for Renee. No information whatsoever anywhere beyond a single line claiming he was the director of Nights. I tried searching for records of anyone with that name who died in Paris in 1968 and found nothing, but without buying a subscription to all these different services, there is limited information available to me. Someone who ran the website nashi.com has been investigating this movie for many years, though the page for the lost movie is now defunct, so I'm not sure if they're still looking into it. They were contacted by a respected genre film historian named Jean-Claude Michel, who had done his own investigations and had this to say. First, it has been said that René Govard, the mentioned director, was a French television director. I have many acquaintances with French TV, and I can affirm that nobody by the name of René Govard has been employed by French TV in any capacity. Secondly, Govard being a very rare name in this country, but a real film director named Ivan Govard really made French films, but it was decades ago. I called the rare Govards found in the phone repertory that entire France, and none of these families had a René Govard among their parents. This would suggest that Renee never existed, though it might be worth considering that Renee Govar could be a pseudonym. Same goes for Monique Brainville and Peter Beaumont. So just because we can't find records of them doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't exist, especially if they went by different names before or after this. So far, we have 3 individuals associated with this movie that we can't even verify the existence of. There are actually 3 more individuals to look into: C. Bellard, one of the writers, and B.B. Novak and Helen Vattel, who were allegedly other cast members. C. Bellard is another dead end. A few sites, including IMDb and Signs.com, list them as a writer for Nights of the Werewolf, but provide no further information, and there's nothing else to suggest this individual was a real person. Pretty much the same for Helen Vattel. The only other information I found was that she apparently has a net worth of $4 million, but I don't know how anyone would know that when she isn't linked with any other movies under that name, and Nights was never even released, so presumably no one made any money from it. There isn't much more information for Bieber Novak, but she does in fact seem to be, or has been, a legit actor, who also starred in at least 2 other movies: El Vertigo del Crimen from 1970 and The Vampire Happening from 1971, though she was uncredited in the latter, so presumably played a very small role. Still no photos of her either, but apparently her real name is Desanka Novakovic. There is a memorial page on findagrave.com for someone of that name, born in 1936 and died in 2015 in Austria. Could be a match, but who knows without more information. Problem is, I'm not sure how anyone knows that Bieber was affiliated with Nights of the Werewolf in the first place. She isn't mentioned in the Wikipedia article or on the Lost Media Wiki, and any other sites that reference her, including IMDb and lostfilms.eu, provide no sources to show where they got that information. So what other evidence is there to support the existence of this film? Well, there are apparently at least 1 or 2 different stills from Nights. The image on screen now is the one most commonly associated with it. Cerebrin.wordpress.com describes a photo of Valdemar the werewolf in a white shirt and makeup with a demonic expression, though this photo is not shared on the blog. I assume this is in fact referring to the image that you can see now. What is unusual though is that this image is in black and white, yet all the subsequent films are in colour, and Mark of the Werewolf, which according to Paul came before Nights, was also in colour. Why would Nights be the only one in black and white? There are claims elsewhere online that more stills exist that haven't been matched to the other movies. Unfortunately, most of these comments don't actually accompany the image itself and just provide a description, so it's impossible to figure out if they were actually a still from a different movie. Some have suggested that a photo of Valdemar peering over a banister at the bottom of the stairs is a still from Nights, but this actually appears to be from Night, not Nights of the Werewolf. This is getting kinda confusing, right? There's another still from the Cerebrin blog that shows a woman lying on the ground as a werewolf in a light-coloured suit approaches her. Reverse image searches revealed no exact match anywhere else on the internet, so this could be from Nights, but considering almost all of the films in the Valdemar Daninsky series were released almost 2 decades before the internet was even introduced to the public, and most haven't been particularly popular since, it'd be hardly surprising that one still from one of those films only appears on one site and nowhere else. The only way to determine whether it is from Nights is through a process of elimination, so please let me know in the comments if you recognise the photo or even the actress in it. A commenter on the Cerebrin blog claimed to have actually seen the movie, quote, in Paris without sound in a poor montage. Someone else claimed to have seen the movie in Spain. Here's a quote from the Nashi.com site referenced earlier. John Pratt, co-author of the splendid book The Roots of Fear, claims that he saw Las Noches del Hombre Lobo in Spain. We have only managed to unearth a few stills, but we are familiar with the film. Suffice to say it had a troubled history. Here's where things get even more confusing. As I said earlier, there are a total of 12 films in the Valdemar Daninsky franchise, including Nights of the Werewolf. It has been speculated that Paul was mistaken and that Nights never did exist. Either he got it confused with one of the other 11 movies, or he somehow merged parts of different movies in his mind and was convinced Nights was a whole separate movie in itself. A couple of minutes ago, I mentioned Night of the Werewolf, also titled The Craving in the US. It was released in 1981 and 1985 in Spain and the US, respectively. One might think that the similarity between the titles, the difference being only one letter in night and nights, might have caused the potential confusion for Paul. Judging by the poster though, it seems that this movie was officially titled El Retorno del Hombre Lobo, or The Return of the Wolfman. The plot is also very different. Valdemar is already an established character by this point and has been sentenced to be executed with his mistress and her coven of witches. The other film that could have been mistaken for Nights is Mark of the Wolfman. I already mentioned the confusion surrounding which came first, Mark or Nights. Apparently Mark was in production from February to March 1968 and released at the end of July that same year. So unless Nights was in production in January, this leaves us with two possibilities. Nights, if it existed, was produced after Mark, like Paul implied in the 1994 interview, or Nights was actually produced sometime before 1968. Another piece of information that suggests that Nights was actually produced after Mark is that apparently Paul initially had no intentions of playing the role of Valdemar Daninsky in Mark, and instead hoped to cast Lon Chaney Jr., an American actor whose performance he'd been impressed by in the 1943 American horror film Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. It wouldn't really make sense for Paul to play Valdemar in Nights, then for it to be later reported that he had no intention of playing the character in the subsequent film. Either way, at least part of the plot of Mark sounds somewhat similar to Nights, according to Wikipedia. A drunken gypsy couple spending the night in the abandoned Castle Wolfstein accidentally resurrect the werewolf Emo Wolfstein when they remove the silver cross from his corpse. Once alive, he not only kills the gypsy couple, but also wreaks havoc on a nearby village. The villagers attribute the attack to ordinary wolves, and in response form a hunting party to kill off the animals. While on the hunt, Count Valdemar Daninsky is attacked by Emo Wolfstein and is afflicted with lycanthropy. After killing innocent victims in the midst of his transformation, he seeks help from specialists Dr. Janos de Mikkelhoff and his wife, who turn out to be two vampires, who then prey on both Janis and Rudolf, Valdemar's friends. The vampires revive the first werewolf, Ema, from the dead, and force the two werewolves to battle each other. Valdemar kills Imre Wolfstein with his fangs and then destroys the two vampires, only to be killed in turn by bullets fired by Janis, the woman who loved him the most. The part about Valdemar seeking help from Dr. Janos de Mikkelov and his wife could line up with the professor pretending to help Valdemar in Nights but actually having ulterior motives, but it's still not close enough for me to believe that Nights is actually Mark. In Nights, according to Paul, Valdemar is a student of the professor. There's no mention of the professor being a vampire, and he was using Valdemar as an instrument for revenge. Throughout 12 movies in a franchise, you'd expect there to be some vaguely similar plot lines, so I'd be more inclined to chalk it up to that than Paul getting confused. I could buy other people getting them mixed up, for example Joan Pratt, who claimed to have seen the movie in Spain, and others who believe they saw stills. The stills might actually be from Mark or later movies. Paul didn't just hear about this movie though, he didn't even just star in it, he literally wrote the script. What are the chances that he got confused with another script that he wrote for a movie that actually ended up getting released? What are the chances that he was mistaken about the story of the fatal car crash involving Renee, the director, who isn't listed in the credits of any of the other movies in the franchise? Not to mention his claim that Peter Beaumont and Monique Brainville were his co-stars, and there is no mention of either of those appearing in any of the other films. Given that, despite his speculation, Paul doesn't seem to know exactly why Nights never did materialise, I did consider the possibility that the scenes he filmed for Nights ended up being used in the later films and he just didn't realise, but I'm not sure how plausible that is either. Paul never actually saw Nights, but he almost definitely watched each of the other 11 films. Surely you would recognise the scenes he remembers from Nights, and it'd click that they were recycled into later instalments. I'm familiar with the concept of false memories, but that would be one hell of a false memory. For him to be convinced that he wrote an entire script, spent 5 weeks filming alongside 3 other people he specifically named, others he couldn't remember the names of, one he remembers the death of, and all of it was a figment of his imagination, it just doesn't quite add up, especially considering Paul insisted until his death that Nights existed. He died of pancreatic cancer in November 2009 at the age of 75, and I found no mention of dementia or any other condition that might have affected his memory or caused any delusions. Ultimately, I don't personally believe that Paul was mistaken and somehow thought Nights was a whole separate film when it was actually part of another, so what else could explain this? Perhaps the most popular theory is that Paul intentionally fabricated this entire story. Nights of the Werewolf never existed and he knew it. He just wanted to boost his resume when he was starting out in the industry to make it look like he was more experienced than he actually was. This would explain a lot. The lack of information about Nights is kinda strange, especially considering that the franchise ended up being quite popular. You'd think, if Nights ever existed, that more of the people involved would have spoken out. I don't know about anyone else, but if I were Paul and I wrote and acted in a movie that somehow got lost and people were questioning its existence, I'd want to seek out the other people who worked on it with me and try to find any record of it. Paul did say he tried to locate it without success, but, and maybe this is just me being too curious for my own good, I don't think I'd be able to rest until I'd turned over every stone. It's questionable that there seems to be no evidence that some of the actors ever existed, let alone were cast in this film, but it's just bizarre that the identity of the director, who Paul claimed was a TV director so should have had previous experience, also can't be verified. It sounds like the film historian who contacted the person who ran Nashi.com went to great lengths to try and find Renee to no avail. Perhaps the simplest explanation is that Renee was a figment of Paul's imagination. All that said, this movie was allegedly produced in 1968, a time before the internet was available to the public. Just because there are no records online of these people doesn't mean there are no records at all. When it comes to such old mysteries, I believe the answers are usually out there somewhere, but sometimes the people with those answers aren't aware that there is a mystery. The Wikipedia page for Nights was created in 2006, and the Lost Media Wiki article was created many years later. Anyone who might have had the answers may not have even been alive at this point. This doesn't explain the lack of records for René, as the film historian claimed to have verified that he was never employed in the French TV industry, and also contacted everyone in France with the surname Gauvard, and none of them were aware of any family members with the first name René. That would only prove or disprove René's existence if René Gauvard was his real name though. Official records would have his birth name, and there are a number of possibilities to explain the lack of records for his previous work. Perhaps he only used the name René Gauvard for this film, or maybe he was an aspiring director and lied to Paul about his past experience to secure the partnership, when in actuality this would be his first project. Not to put my tinfoil hat on here, but if we consider the possibility that René Gauvard was a pseudonym used by a real person, how do we know he didn't fake his own death? René could have been anyone, an honest man trying to make it in a tough industry, or a con man whose scam failed. Either way, what better way to avoid taking accountability for the failure of a movie that clearly had potential, hence the franchise ended up a success, than to kill off the character who was responsible for its downfall? This is of course pure speculation, and perhaps the simplest explanation is that Paul just fabricated René, the actors involved, and the film itself. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know, but there are a few points that make me doubt this. Firstly, he never actually admitted to lying, which doesn't automatically prove he didn't, but for decades he insisted that this film existed. It wasn't just a passing comment he made when he was a nobody, he stuck with it even after he made it big. His career began taking a turn for the worse by 1985, and arguably, had he later revealed his lie, the revelation of him pulling off an elaborate hoax could have attracted more publicity than him sticking with the story of a film that had faded into obscurity, if it had ever even left that realm. Surely it'd be worth a try at least. As a comment on the Cerebrin blog stated, the possibility of the invented film is almost more attractive, suggestive, and legendary than that of the lost film. However, it's certainly possible that if Paul did lie, he was too ashamed to admit it later. Perhaps when he first publicly spoke of Nights, he just blurted it out without thinking, seeing it as an insignificant, trivial little lie, one that would soon be forgotten. Yet when it kept being brought up, he had to double down on it so as not to seem unreliable or dishonest. It snowballed, and then came the fake director and actors, the made-up scenes he remembered filming, the concoction of him trying and failing to locate the film at a later date. You really could argue either way. Secondly, the most plausible timeline seems to be that Nights of the Werewolf was the second film in the series after Mark of the Wolfman, especially considering Paul himself claimed that. According to Wikipedia regarding Mark of the Wolfman, Naschy got the idea to make the first Spanish werewolf film while he was working on Agonizing in Crime in 1967. He broached the idea to the director of that film, Enrique Aguilas, who initially tried to dissuade him from doing it. Naschy tried to interest Spanish director Armando de Osorio in the project, who also tried to dissuade him. Finally, Aguilas reconsidered and helped Naschy to find an interested Spanish film producer. Mark of the Wolfman was produced by DC Films. I couldn't find much information for the studio as the results were saturated with DC, the superhero movies and comic book publisher, but this is, or was, presumably a legit company. If Paul was going to fabricate this story to boost his resume, wouldn't the perfect time have been before he ever actually managed to release a movie? Would there be much benefit after you already completed a much more successful project in pretending you worked on another that ultimately failed? I'm just not sure I see many benefits in making a point about a movie that never came into fruition, when the sole focus could have been on a movie that did, and did relatively well. Furthermore, why would Nights of the Werewolf fail to materialise when Mark of the Wolfman, its predecessor, did relatively well? The cost of production was reportedly $300,000, and the film grossed enough to cover that, as well as earning $700,000 overseas. So at least the story of the film never being released because no one paid the negative cost seems unlikely. On the flip side, this could totally point to Nights never actually existing. It doesn't really add up that Paul, or the company he worked with on Mark, would allow the film not to happen, after a decent amount of money had likely already been spent, a fairly good budget for its time according to Paul, and filming had been completed, when spending a bit more money would probably have turned a loss into a profit, following the relative success of the film before it. If the film had been destroyed during René's fatal car accident, however, this would make more sense. It cost a lot more to reshoot the whole movie than it would just to pay the negative costs. But remember, Paul himself, the only person to have vehemently insisted that this movie did exist, did not claim this is what happened. His version of events was to do with legal problems resulting from René's death. Without further information regarding these legal problems, it's impossible to speculate on whether Nights could have been salvaged. I would have thought that considering Paul wrote the script, it would be his intellectual property, and so I'm not sure what legal problems arising from René's death would have halted production. But as I said before, I know next to nothing about film production, so if anyone can enlighten me, please do so in the comments. As for the still that no one has been able to link to one of the other films in the series, some believe Paul staged it himself to support his fabricated story. It has also been suggested that the photo was faked for a documentary that was produced years later about Paul. I found a few comments online, mostly on Spanish blogs or forums, from people claiming that they have seen the other 11 movies and the still definitely wasn't from any of those. I haven't personally seen them, so can't verify, but if we are to believe these comments, that leaves only 4 possibilities. The still was from Nights of the Werewolf, proving its existence. The still was from a deleted scene from one of the other movies, or just a random photo someone took of Paul when he was in costume during filming of one of the other movies. Or the still was staged by Paul. Or the still was staged for the documentary in a time where CGI and editing had advanced enough to make it relatively easy to do so. It has been noted that the costume Paul is wearing in this image is different to his appearance in the other films, but this could still support any of the theories. It was from Nights, or it was from another movie during a scene rehearsal before the costume changed, or Paul or the documentary crew staged it. Overall, opinion is split on whether Nights of the Werewolf actually existed, or if it was an elaborate hoax, with perhaps a slightly higher number of internet sleuths believing the latter. Ultimately, there's no solid evidence to prove one way or the other, and I think the ambiguity is partly why I find this piece of lost media so intriguing. There are many examples of lost media where the existence of it is unconfirmed, but usually this is a question of whether or not a confirmed event was caught on camera, not whether or not the event even occurred in the first place. There are so many questions surrounding Nights. Did Paul ever even write a script for it? If so, were any of the scenes filmed? If so, what happened to the footage? Is there any chance of it ever being recovered today? Continuing on from the quote from Jean-Claude Michel, the film historian who contacted the owner of the Nashi.com site, stating he did not believe René was ever a French TV director, and that he contacted everyone in France with the surname Gauvin and found no one who acknowledged René as a relative. Quote, "None of the actors mentioned for this film seem to exist really. In any case, none of them made any other picture or was syndicated. Fourth, when a film, including co-productions, is shot in France, it must be declared to the CNC, Centre National du Cinéma, and must have a complete file with the screenplay, list of crew, cast, the director, insurance company, etc. There is no exception to this rule, except of course if a film is shot clandestinely, or in the case of an amateur production. I made a request to the CNC about this film and the answer was, it doesn't exist. Even if some problems happened during production or after, it seems incredible that nobody could have seen the potential of a Waldemar Daninsky picture with Paul Nashi in the 1970s, when his popularity, including in France, was at its zenith." Jean-Claude Michel concluded that he believes the film does not exist, but added that he would be happy to be proven wrong. The site owner didn't seem quite so convinced. Quote, "There are many possibilities, but the following should be considered. Nashi has never seen the completed film and, as far as I know, has not even seen the dailies, rushes from the shooting. I left after my work was finished," states Nashi. How long Nashi was in Paris is unknown, though Nashi mentions a 5-week schedule for the entire film. It is possible that Nashi was in Paris for a brief while, and that any information he received afterward of the production was provided by a person, producer, director, someone else involved in the film, who was motivated to give him news that may not have been the complete truth. This is one scenario, but any other could be plausible. Another issue needs to be addressed because of the suspicions of some that the picture was never made and that Nashi included the title in his resume at an early, pivotal time in his career, when such a credit could have impressed Spanish and foreign producers to hire him for future projects. It should be understood that it is perfectly natural and common for actors to plump up the importance of their previous roles and films to prospective producers and investors. This is the way the game is played in the film business, a game used in other businesses also. Even a partially made film can and does get used as a credit at times. Yet the suspicions of some people hold that this credit is completely false. Nashi's response has been consistent. He did go to Paris to make this film. In my study of Nashi over the years, it has been my experience that while he may not be clear on certain facts, we are talking about films made decades ago, there is always, at the very least, a measure of truth in what he says. To give an example, in the above-mentioned Videos interview, Nashi says this about Mainly on the Plains, an episode of I Spy in which he appeared with Boris Karloff. I played the role of a villain. This episode was never shown in Spain because the police were bad guys, and back then such a thing was unthinkable. Nashi is in this episode for sure, but he plays just one of several picnickers who wind up having a bit of fun with the Karloff character. And, I believe, the bad guys were merely in disguise as the police, a plot point Nashi would have been unaware of at the time of the shoot. It is possible that Nashi appeared in another I Spy episode. I still have to check all the episodes of the show that were filmed in Spain, but though Nashi's memory of that particular episode may be somewhat faulty regarding the role he played, or perhaps not if he did have such a role but it was cut, it is true that he appeared in I Spy and in a scene with Karloff. My example has a further point. Even as recently as 1999, respected writers were questioning the veracity of parts of Nashi's filmography. Carlos Aguilar, in his Cine Fantástico y de Terror Español 1900 to 1983, does not list the I Spy episode because, according to him, there is no confirmation that Nashi did indeed appear in the show. He underlines his doubt by tagging Nashi's involvement, somewhat mockingly, as his supposed intervention. Well, Nashi is in the episode, no doubt of that. I've seen it with my own two contact-lensed eyes. In somewhat contrast to the final point made by that person, one commenter on the Cerebrum blog believed that Paul was a narcissist and that inventing such stories would align with his nature. Quote, Jacinto Molina, who must be valued and thanked for his priceless work in favour of Spanish terror, also had some problems that must be known, fundamentally derived from his pathological narcissism. And this is by no means the only invented story. I have heard in interviews countless anecdotes directly incredible or later denied by the directors. Directors whom he used to ignore because he could not stand the idea that a film written by him could succeed thanks to the director. I venerate his memory, but also that of the remembered Leon Klimowski and Carlos Aurred, without whom there would not have been the best films in which Paul Nashi intervened. Personally, I think the chances of the whole film, or at least all the unedited scenes being recovered, is almost non-existent, and it's unlikely that we'll ever even see any of the scenes, or stills, assuming Paul is telling the truth about any scenes being filmed in the first place. Nights was allegedly filmed 55 years ago. Paul and anyone else who may have been involved are likely dead at this point, and in a time before even the most mundane occurrences were posted on social media or saved onto some kind of electronic device, if footage was lost, it's probably lost forever. As for the whole mystery of whether Paul was even telling the truth, the only theory I feel fairly confident in ruling out is that Paul mistakenly believed Nights was an actual movie, due to him getting mixed up with the other films in the franchise, for example. In my mind, either he intentionally fabricated the whole story, or he was telling the truth, and he really did write the script and film the scenes, and something happened to the footage, resulting in the film never being finished or released. I lean slightly towards the latter because I just don't see that much reason for him to have made it all up. But as I said, there isn't really any evidence to point one way or the other. It's just a matter of speculation and, to some extent, opinion. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for any future videos. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Remember to click the link in the description to download June's Journey for free and become a detective today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week in a new video.